as a heads up, Mary, this is a public meeting unless you ask for it to be an executive. I can't imagine that it would need to be, but I'll let you make the call. But right now we're public and will remain that way unless you ask that it be a closed meeting. And I had informed the council that as well. I think we're fine being public. The Custer Gallatin National Forest Plan has been years in the making. The CSKT has been consulted many times. We have given our input to the extent that it's been incorporated. We appreciate it. To the extent that wasn't, we raised some objections and went through that process, but not everybody gets what they want. I know that the current chair is very familiar with this. He was part of our team that met with the Forest Service and worked on this, at least from the natural resources end of it. I know, well, I'm fairly sure Shane in our shop when he was there, who covers a lot of the cultural resource stuff, had some input on that. I covered the natural resource end of it. So the forest plan is finished. It's ready to get rolled out. And Mary and her team are here before the full rollout to go over it with the council, to answer any questions on how some of the process went, what things will look like going forward, and what our relationship with the Custer Gallatin will continue to be. And so I'll turn it over to Mary and her folks. They did Martin for some of the logistics. They have a PowerPoint, and I'm not sure how we'll do that. I'll let you guys figure that out on the technical side, but I'll let Mary get to that with her team and introduce her team, and we'll go from there. And appreciate the council and the Forest Service getting together here and making time. And I'll step aside. So thanks.
Thank you, John, and welcome, Mary. It's good to see you. Mary and I have been working together for quite some time. I think goes back to 2005 or 6, somewhere in there. We worked together on the Interagency Bison Management Plan Partners Group, and so she's very familiar with our restoration of our treaty rights and bison. So, Mary, good to see you.
Thank you so much, everyone. So well, first of all, it's really an honor, and we recognize you have a lot on your plates and a lot that you're working on. So just thank you so much for the time. When you mentioned how long I've been working on IBMP, it makes me feel like I've been around a while, and I'm certainly feeling a little bit older, but yeah, really looking forward to the opportunity to just share where we're at. We're right at that finish line, but I would be remiss if I didn't just acknowledge just sincerely how wonderful the CSKT, the staff and others have been to work with on this process. I think the relationships we built over the years on working on IBMP really set a foundation for having good conversations and keeping each other updated, and really looking forward to that moving forward. I was going to very quickly just ask my folks who are on just to, if they don't have their camera, just quickly say their name and just kind of wave at you. I know in the Zoom world, we wave more, right? And that's not typical meeting etiquette, but we're wavers here. So I'm Mary Erickson, the Forest Supervisor. Kathy, you want to wave?
Yeah, I'm Kathy Miner, the Deputy Forest Supervisor.
And Virginia Kelly?
Hi, Virginia Kelly. I'm the Plan Revision Team Leader.
And Halcyon? Halcyon, are you there? Halcyon may be having challenges with her.
I am here. I'm here. And I'm waving. I'm Halcyon LaPointe. I'm the Tribal Liaison and the Heritage Program Manager on the forest. And I'd also like to thank everyone for our 4-year journey and helping us so much. So thank you.
And I think the last person, I'm looking at my list, is Mike Thome. You want to jump in?
Yep. Good afternoon, everybody. Mike Thome, District Ranger on the Gardner District.
Thanks, everyone. Again, I just wanted to make sure that folks who you all have worked with over the years had a chance to say hi. And again, appreciate the chance to be here. Congratulations to the new members of the council. I know that's a huge honor and a really big deal. And so really looking forward to working with you in that capacity. We have about a 12-slide PowerPoint, but we're pretty informal here. So my thought was to go through that, to have Virginia put it on the screen, to run through that fairly quickly, kind of at that high level, and then at the end, make sure there's time for questions, anything that you want to do a deeper conversation on. But also, if something doesn't make sense as I'm presenting it, don't hesitate to shout out. I just may not, I might not see you if you're waving your hand, but I'll hear you if you want me to stop for a second.
That sounds great.
Okay. Great. Thank you. Okay, so again, this is the overview of the Custer Gallatin National Forest plan revision effort. I recognize that the CSKT have worked with a number of other national forests in plan revision efforts, and you and your staff know and understand this a lot about the process. I think you've probably worked with the Flathead National Forest closely as they were working through revision, and I assume the Helena, Lewis, and Clark. And also you've been on this journey with us for the Custer Gallatin National Forest. The Forest Service likes to think forest plan revision is ideally would like to get it to be a 4-year process. This was about a 6-year process, but when you throw in a government furlough and a pandemic and an administration change and a few other things into the mix of the complexity, we're feeling good about having worked through this process and having worked with the tribes as partners and getting there in 6 years. So we started this in January of 2016, and we're probably at this point, we're estimating that we're a couple weeks away from signing that record of decision. Right now, the date that it's not something we're putting out publicly, but we're saying that date is Friday, January 28th. And that's only resting on getting to the final biological opinion from U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. And the good news is we have the draft and we've looked through a lot of it, and we don't seem to have, we're pretty comfortable with what we've got. So we're thinking that date is going to be good. Next slide, Virginia. So what we thought we would do in this meeting is just, again, give a quick overview of the upcoming decision, including addressing that concerns raised by the tribes. And I know we've gone through this in previous consultation meetings, probably in a little bit more detail, but since this is coming out at the end of a long process, it just seemed like such a great opportunity to share and maybe as a reminder of where we've been and share what's going to be in that final plan decision. We'll give a little bit of an overview of next steps, that release of the final plan, the environmental impact statement, and the decision. And then at the end of the time today, have time for questions and answers or anything we haven't touched on enough. Next slide. So this is just the quick map of the Custer Gallatin National Forest. I think folks are aware that Custer Gallatin National Forest was officially consolidated what was the old Custer National Forest and the Gallatin National Forest, and we were officially consolidated as one administrative unit in 2014, which was timely because that was the start of our planning process in 2016, and that really helped frame the decision that we would develop one plan for that combined unit. But from this picture, you can see these are what we called geographic areas in the forest plan, and in the planning process, we're a pretty spread out national forest. A lot of the units really curving around Yellowstone National Park, and then the Bridger Bangtails to the north, but then going out to the Pryor Mountains, and then of course in eastern Montana and into South Dakota with the Ashland and the Sioux Ranger districts. So that gives you a little sense. It's about 400 miles as the crow flies from end to end. And a lot of diversity and variety in those landscapes. Next slide. This is a slide I think folks have seen at every previous meeting. It just gives that picture of what the process looks like in those big milestones. Again, the January 2016 public launch, where we worked on that first year, really working on the assessment of existing conditions and the information around need to change. We sent that out for review. We developed a proposed action. We did a lot of the other pieces around wilderness inventory and wild and scenic river eligibility, worked through a proposed action, a draft EIS, a final EIS that went out in July of 2020 that goes out for the objection process. We'll talk about that a little bit later. And then once we move through the objection process and had the objection review completed, we've really put that all together, finishing our consultation with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. And at the point of issuing a decision, this says early 2022. I think we had to develop that slide and hedge our bets a little bit, because we think it's January of 2022, but until we see that final biological opinion, we can't be 100% sure. But that's where we're at, right where the red arrow is. Next slide. So this slide summarizes in a very broad sense the concerns that were raised by the multiple tribes that we worked with through this process. As the Custer Gallatin started the process and reached out to tribal governments, we ended up having 19 tribal governments that we consulted with. Not all of those 19 tribes actually provided the same depth of comment and the same level of engagement through that process. But these are the concerns that were raised by tribes when you compile those together. The concern around really the reinforcement of reserved treaty rights, protection of treaty resources, how we address how we address sacred sites and landscapes, that protection of and access to traditional, religious, sacred, and ceremonial sites, cultural resource protection, and then of course for more focused on the western side of the forest and the concerns around bison and bighorn sheep. And well, bison, of course, because of the focus on Yellowstone bison. Next slide. So then this is kind of summarizing that to the concerns and interests and points of discussion with the Salish Kootenai tribe over the years. And when we put this on a slide, this is almost like shorthand for describing the dialogues we've had over the years and the concerns, not necessarily just during formal comment periods, but the conversations we've had over these multiple years. Clearly a need to focus on our consultation efforts and make sure that we're clear what that is and redeeming those responsibilities, that the plan addresses reserved treaty rights and treaty resources and is clear on our responsibilities and obligations there. Some interest around weed treatment and the role of goats and pack goats in that work. The portion of the plan that addresses protection of cultural resources, and as a piece of that, how we address place names over time. And there's a lot of, there's probably a lot of long overdue effort and attention to thinking about how we share traditional place names and how we think about place names for areas of the forest. And last, but certainly not least, the concerns and interest around bison and bighorn sheep. And then we'll go into that in a bit more detail. Next slide. So when we put out the final plan prior to the objection period, as you know, in that process, that's the process for all persons, parties, tribes, agencies who have participated up to that point to participate in an objection process. And in the objection process, those who have standing can either object to what was in the plan decision or can express interest as an interested person or party in that process. And that really allows participation in that. So the Salish Kootenai tribe participated as interested party in fall of 2020. And in that, John, I'm thinking that it was you and Tom who participated in those meetings. Of course, by the time we got to this point, we were in the pandemic. So a lot of things had to switch to virtual, which, we've all learned a lot through virtual, but we never would have, we had to really adapt on the fly to working a lot of those things virtually. So the objection process and meetings with our regional forester and with our Washington office were held virtually over, I think, 3 very long, intensive days with objectors and interested persons. The topics that the tribe raised in the interested person letter were really, there were a lot of depth to that, thinking about designated areas and land allocations and what type of land management direction we have, whether we're using best available scientific information, and of course, a lot of interest in bison, bighorn sheep, disease transmission, wildlife connectivity, and the role of species of conservation concern. So again, summarize those as the portions of our plan that address treaty rights, bison, and species of conservation concern. Next slide. When you think about our plan and how we've addressed wildlife species, there's kind of that, what we always talk about as that coarse filter, fine filter approach embedded in the plan as a whole. In terms of at-risk species management, when you think about terrestrial and aquatic species, there's 5 threatened or endangered species: lynx, grizzly bear, northern long-eared bat, the western glacier stonefly, and whooping crane, and 4 species of conservation concern: greater sage grouse, white-tailed prairie dog, west slope cutthroat trout, and western pearl shell. And then in botanical species, there's the 1 species proposed for listing, that's whitebark pine, and 25 botanical or plant species of conservation concern. I think, thinking through this process, wolverine were dropped as a proposed species in December of 2020, but we carried direction for wolverine, how we address and protect habitat for wolverine through the document. The status of whitebark pine changed during the process, and they changed from candidate to proposed. And again, that direction is integrated into the plan. We'll talk about this a little bit more on the following slide, but there was a concern from a number of tribes, including the CSKT, that around bison as a species of conservation concern. There was a lot of discussion of that through the objection process. That choice or that decision is at the regional forester level, kind of my boss. In the end, bison were not flagged as a species of conservation concern, nor were bighorn sheep. But the way we addressed that in the plan was to make sure that we actually had adequate guidance and objectives and direction around how we would manage, how we would work with tribes, how we would manage bison habitat, how we would partner others on those issues. And we have a lot of guidance around bighorn sheep and goats as well. Next slide. So kind of the pending decision summary, and again, this is very high level, and we can go into more detail to the extent folks would like. Throughout the process, there was this conversation about our bison as species of conservation concern within the kind of the narrowly defined directives the Forest Service had to identify species of conservation concern. And as we walk through that, even though they didn't turn out as a species of conservation concern, we felt very strongly that we can address appropriate management for bison. We felt like we could address the concerns that people would have for the Forest Service's role in facilitating bison expansion, and we could get that in this new plan in a way we haven't had in our existing plan. So the pending decision speaks to how to facilitate bison expansion on the national forest. I think folks know as bison come out of Yellowstone National Park, the public lands they meet there that are principally the Custer Gallatin National Forest, the old Gallatin National Forest side as bison come out on the north side or the west side. We talked about facilitating expansion with the focus mostly into the area that coincides with the grizzly bear primary conservation area. And that maybe you might not want to go into this level of detail, but one of the things I know I've heard from county commissioners and others is I really need to clarify that we didn't put any limits in this plan on where bison could expand over the life of the plan. The PCA, as we call it, was not meant to say, it's not a line that says bison can't go beyond that. It was really a way to say, where should we focus our habitat restoration efforts? Where should we focus, the dialogue within expansion of tolerance in the context of the IBMP partners over the life of the plan? And we said, generally, bison are going to expand onto the national forest as they come out of Yellowstone Park on both the west side and the north side. So hopefully we can talk about that more if I didn't explain it well, but I just wanted to make it clear to folks, the PCA boundary is not saying that's a boundary that bison can't cross on this national forest. And we tried to make that clear in the text of the plan, that we would work with the state and partners to try to build expanded tolerance for bison as the years go ahead. And then we would also commit to 3 enhancement projects every 3 years so that we could really work with tribes and partners on where are the right places to focus our habitat restoration work. In terms of bighorn sheep also not a species of conservation concern, but we spent a lot of time around the direction for bighorn sheep. And there's a lot here, but in summary, we said, we don't currently have domestic sheep allotments on the Custer Gallatin National Forest. A lot of those were phased out a number of years ago because of conflicts with grizzly bears. And so we were clear in the guidance here that we would not permit new domestic sheep or goat grazing in the greater Yellowstone units, kind of those western units, districts, or in the Pryor Mountains. We said out in eastern Montana and South Dakota, they could be considered with a risk assessment. That's not a yes, they would be permitted. It's just that, yes, you could go through that consideration and that process at some later date. With recreational pack goats, I would never have predicted going into the planning process that goats were going to be of as much interest to the public and others as they ended up being in this process. But there was a lot of interest in how to think about the use of recreational pack goats and what were appropriate conditions. And those interests came both from making sure that we're not setting up a concern about disease transmission, but also from the recreational pack goat community, that we have a process whereby if people follow appropriate best science and guidance, that they could use pack goats. So we have language around that. Eventually we'll have to put some special orders in place to implement that, but we do allow recreational pack goats in some parts of the forest with very specific conditions in the Pryors, the Absaroka Beartooth, Madison, Gallatin, Henry's, and then with risk assessments in the Bridgers, Crazy Mountains, and Ashland and Sioux District. And then we also ended up speaking to whether we would allow the use of domestic sheep or goats for weed control. And in the end, we did say, and I recall this topic also coming up at a previous consultation meeting with folks. And in the end, we said, yes, they could be allowed. And part of the reason for that is we wanted to keep the options and the tools on the table. And again, when we say allowed, that would be very controlled. It might be a contract for use of goats in a very specific area. So these wouldn't be long-term permits that allow sheep and goats for weed control. They would be really where that is the best tool, and you would go through the assessment and you would target that. Okay, next slide. So when we look at that together, kind of how the plan addressed the concerns of the Confederated Salish Kootenai tribe, the plan direction, again, I'm kind of given that high level because there's a whole lot more meat in the plan itself, but really addresses consultation and coordination goals throughout the plan itself, and make sure that that's really highlighted both in the plan and in the record of decision. The plan speaks to reserve treaty rights and treaty resources, and it really attempts to highlight our responsibilities and obligations in that way. We do speak to cultural resources and place names and how we address that over time. And we know there's also ongoing work with the CSKT and other tribes on traditional place names and how we think about that going forward. We already spoke to bison, bighorn sheep, and weed treatment and how that's embedded in it. I think the point I would make is, and I suspect this is the questions people have, is the balance we struck in the plan was our current plan that we're living under is basically silent on bison. It really doesn't speak to our obligation as a national forest that to support tolerance for bison, to support habitat management. So this plan really highlights our responsibilities and obligations and our vision and strategies around that. It also acknowledges that the Forest Service will need to work with partners and tribes and state agencies on bison management. I know there was some interest from, I don't know if we heard this as much from the tribal governments, but certainly from some NGOs that really they want us to basically tell the state of Montana that they don't have any authority in the management of bison, and that the Forest Service would control that. And this plan really articulates our desire to expand tolerance for bison, to really do that habitat restoration work, but to do that in a partnership context with the tribes and the state agencies. So I think the point I was making there is that this bison direction probably isn't everything everyone wanted to see, but for us, it's a huge step forward in really acknowledging that we need to be receptive to bison on the landscape. We need to make sure from a management standpoint, we remove barriers to bison being on the landscape, whether that's our grazing allotments, or whether that's fencing, or whether that's something else. And we need to be proactive in thinking about habitat restoration, but we need to do that in the context of really working in partnership with tribes and state agencies and other federal agencies. Next slide. So where we're going in 2022, again, this slide keeps saying early 2022 for that decision, right? If I told you today where I think we're going to be, we're poised and having everything ready to sign that plan decision on Friday, January 28th. And assuming we're on track with that, we would also be sure to give the tribes a heads up, right before that we sign that and that decision comes out. But that's what we're predicting at this point, just a couple weeks away. The way the process works is that once the decision is signed, there's a 30-day stay of implementation, meaning we can't sign any decisions, project level decisions, for 30 days after that forest plan record of decision is signed. We can put some projects out for scoping, or we can put some draft environmental assessments out for people to take a look at that are in compliance with this new plan, but we can't sign any decisions for 30 days after the plan decision comes out. And then obviously 2022 and beyond, we really implement the plan. We work with tribes and partners and communities to move out on it and try to do the right work in the right place. And we monitor the plan and make changes as we go ahead. I think that was maybe my last slide, or there might be a slide that says questions. So with that, I don't know if it's easiest, if folks, well, let's turn the thing off so that we could at least see if there's some questions. And then if there are some slides we need to go back to, we could pull that back up.
Questions from council? One thing, Mary, I know I brought this up before, and so in the protecting treaty rights and the resources for the tribes, our secured rights and access to the national forest lands. One of the things I think I brought up earlier was just the sheer growth and sheer number of recreationists in your landscape, in your forest, and how sometimes your priority of use can overcome another use. So simply an overwhelming number of recreationists that go into a certain area, then, and a safety protocol comes about that restricts hunting, for example, and how that may impact our rights to subsistence uses that we've been using for such a long time. So I know that's always an issue for us, when safety regulations and so your continued growth of that forest for recreation use days is incredible. So you know, and how that mixes into the areas like the Taylor Fork, where we've identified landscapes in the forest already where buffalo can expand into, and how we would manage that general recreation use to protect that harvesting of buffalo or other species, so there's not a negative effect on our treaty resources and subsistent uses.
Yeah, yeah, appreciate that. It's a fantastic point. I think the plan kind of sets the priorities and framework for that, and the acknowledgement that those treaty rights and, you know, making sure that those should have precedence, but the how you do that and how we work together on identifying those ahead of time rather than in hindsight, where we start to realize that the way we have, the path we're going down to address a public safety concern or something else is, impacting the tribes. It's really going to be important, I think, to just try to get ahead of those and understand it, but absolutely. I assume you're seeing the same thing really up on the Flathead National Forest with that expansion of recreation use and pressures. I didn't touch on this in a real deep way in the presentation, but that concern has been a concern for a lot of our communities as well. And just the concern about wildlife connectivity and how do grizzly bears get from this ecosystem to the next ecosystem in these areas like the Bridger Mountains, where the complexity of recreation events and trail systems and human uses is so great. So we did some work on that and really tried to identify, as it relates to wildlife, key linkage areas where we would start to step out and manage and say no to things that we haven't traditionally said no to. To really say no to new recreation infrastructure and to say no to new recreation events. And I will confess, we haven't really been there that much as a forest in the past. And I do see this plan starting to set more of those sideboards.
Thank you, Mary. I know the other thing that we had talked about numerous times was the use of prescribed fire to help move. And I know you've been focusing on that somewhat, but it's certainly a principal tool that we've always been interested in. And it's certainly in that consideration for wildlife management, restoration, subsistence use, habitat creation. Specifically, I know the Forest Service likes to look at all wildlife, but as you know, buffalo restoration is a key element for us in recognizing the treaty rights. And so use of fire is pretty critical, but the other thing in combination with that is climate change. And so, there was directives before for the federal agencies under different administrations to shy away from climate change specific dialogue. And so maybe you could reflect a little bit on what this forest plan will do in climate change as a topic.
Yeah, thanks. I'll kind of address that at a kind of a high level, and then Virginia, if you want to add something, or I don't go into a lot of detail, because that, first of all, on the role of prescribed fire, couldn't agree with you more. And I know Jason Bray wasn't able to be on the call, and I think that idea of through IBMP of getting really a plan for where are these bison restoration projects and objectives that we should be focusing on as we implement the plan, and having that identified with the tribes and some of our NGO partners sooner rather than later. And we've talked about that with the Taylor Fork and on the west side. Maybe the bison aren't there now, but really getting more definite plans for where we want to do that work. So absolutely couldn't agree with you more. And we do need to step out, because we started that work a few years ago with IBMP, but it felt like we've never really gotten that down to what are the priority areas and landscapes to turn that into project work. In terms of language around climate change, there is so much more in this plan and this EIS than there has been in our previous plans in terms of how you bring science to bear. a lot of the, a lot of the science is really around the science of how you create resilient landscapes and that underpinning of natural range of variability and how you think about what does it take to create and sustain resilient landscapes in the long term, and then puts a focus on a lot of the fuels treatment and fuels work, or in fire sheds or in that front country, and really then the use of maybe wildfire or prescribed fire more in those backcountry landscapes. So that's a pretty general thing, Tom, but I think there's a whole lot more in here around the science of climate change, how you think about it, how you think about retention of old growth forests and older trees, how you think about building resilient landscapes that are going to be resilient in the face of a warming climate, how you think about refugia for native species and native fish. And there's just a lot there. And clearly, I think this, as we started into this process, I think it would be fair to say we were in an administration that really wasn't really favorable to how you address the climate science or how you address climate change, but we knew we had to address best science. So from the beginning of the process, that's really been integrated into the documents and into the analysis. But now a lot of the climate science and how we address climate change is really front and center. Virginia, I know there's probably more. It's such a big topic, kind of hard to know where to go in summarizing that.
So you did a great job, Mary, explaining how climate change is basically embedded in the plan. But in doing so, I think sometimes people want to see a section on climate change, and that's not real evident. So one thing we added to the final EIS is an appendix on climate change that outlines the particular standards and guidelines, et cetera, the pieces of the plan that address climate change. So we did that to make it more kind of evident how we are addressing climate change.
Thank you. Yeah. One of the other things that we had dealt with, and specifically in the Gardner district, I guess, was, and you've done a wonderful job increasing the land base and the forest size there. But early on, we had a conflict over a land swap up in the Eagle Creek area. And it was a land swap for a mining interest way up in the center of the Absaroka Wilderness, and swapping with a local landowner that was key bison corridor habitat and hunting grounds and stuff. But as far as the future for the forest to grow in that area, forest lands to grow, what does the plan envision for that?
So Virginia or Mike, I think I'm going to let you, Tom, if I understand the question, it really is, what foundation does the plan set for the ability to actually acquire lands for conservation purposes, for resource purposes, or support for treaty rights? And there's, I'm going to go on a slight tangent and then turn it to Virginia. I think the plan really speaks to the need to do that and gives us guidance on looking at where those priority landscapes might be. There was some sensitivity from some county commissioners because their growth plans speak to no net increase in federal lands. And we didn't address that in this plan because we said just because a county doesn't want additional federal lands, we can't speak to that as a standard because we may have resource reasons why we really need to add to the federal estate. But Virginia or Mike, more you would say about the language around priorities for land acquisition.
Sure, Mary, and then I'll let you go, Tom, Mike, I mean. So while it doesn't get that specific, the plan about particular places, the plan does have a desired condition to consolidate land ownership because that does reduce like wildlife human conflicts. It provides for connectivity and improves access to public lands. So the big picture desire is set out in the plan.
Yeah, and I think just to add in, I mean, Mary and Virginia covered it pretty well there. I think it's just maintaining our open dialogue that we have and that open communication on what opportunities could come out there. And if that's here with each individual tribe or where it's kind of drummed up in those conversations through bison conversations or whatnot. I think it's just maintaining that open dialogue, open communication, but just echoing also what Mary and Virginia said, and that broad desired condition in the plan to keep that as an emphasis.
Okay, thank you. Council members, any comment or questions? John?
No, I don't, Mr. Chair. I think these guys have heard plenty from me over the years, so I think they're ready to be finished.
Well, thank you. Thank you for the update. I hope there's not too much litigation over it, but you know, I guess that's something to look forward to, as always. But yeah, it's good to see all of you, very much. So hopefully I'll make it there in this next year. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much for your time and all the partnership in getting to this point. And yes, there will be litigation, but the good news for the way these planning efforts work is really we still move forward and implement the new plan, even as we work through the challenges on that. And for us, particularly in the world of bison, I think that's a good thing.
Indeed. Thank you so much for consulting with us and providing this update. Good job. It was a long process, but good job.
Thank you so much. Take care, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you all.
Thanks.
Bye.
Thank you.
That's all I had on that, Mr. Chair. So appreciate the council's time on that. And if you guys have any questions on this as we go forward, you know, I'm here and we can keep working through it. But just wanted to have them come on and present this before it went out to the general public. I thought it was appropriate to have them come to the tribes first. So thanks for your time and making time this afternoon. And I can follow up with you if you have any thoughts over the weekend. Follow up with you on Tuesday on the legal department. I'll also, Mr. Chair, as you know, I'm going to try to reconstitute the Bison staff and however form it'll be. And council members, as we meet, the council members are always welcome to be part of that. So you know, I'll let you guys know about that. But we'll have to come in, and this forest plan can be part of what we're talking about when we talk about the Park Service EIS and other bison related things in the Yellowstone bison area and the wild bison across the state. So we'll just keep working through this. So appreciate the time, and that's all I have unless you have any questions.
Any questions for John? Okay, John, thank you. Thanks for coordinating and setting it up for us. Appreciate it.
Yeah, you bet. Thank you very much.
Okay. Len?
Mr. Chair, there's an issue I wanted to discuss with council in executive session.
Okay, maybe we can call, I think we're gonna have Patty, Rick,